Ever get that feeling?
Yeah.
Like you need a scorecard just to keep up with everything that's happening.
No, tell me about it.
It's like Ukraine, and then the markets go crazy, and now big oil is making these moves. It's like the whole world is playing some kind of crazy speed chess game with our brains.
It really is a lot to process. There's so many headlines. It's hard to see the currents underneath, how these like separate stories are kind of pulling each other along.
Right.
And that's what we're going to try to do today. Try to connect some of those dots between what's happening with geopolitics and the economics and energy.
Yeah. We've got a stack of reports and analyses here all about the major global shifts that are happening right now. You've probably seen some of the headlines, but we're going to figure out what it all means together.
Yeah. Because what's fascinating is that like none of these things are happening on their own. Like take the situation in Ukraine, for example. It's not just another day on the front lines. We may be at a real turning point.
Okay, so break that down for me. What makes this moment so different?
Well, the U.S. just approved sending these long-range missiles to Ukraine,
Yeah.
the kind that can hit targets inside Russia itself. And that's never been done before in terms of U.S. involvement in this conflict.
Hold on. Up until now, haven't they been really careful about the kinds of weapons that they've sent? Wasn't there this line that they wouldn't cross? What changed?
It seems like it's directly tied to North Korea entering into the situation. They're sending thousands of troops now to support Russia.
Oh, wow.
And that adds a whole other layer of complexity and risk to what's happening.
And it's not like Ukraine is waiting around to see what happens either, right?
Right.
I mean, they've already said they want to use these missiles to hit places like Kursk, which is a region they've held since this past summer. This is happening now.
Yeah. And that's where things could really spiral quickly.
Right.
Because how is Russia going to respond to being directly targeted on their own soil? This goes way beyond just like a regional conflict at this point.
Right.
You know, we're talking about potential global destabilization.
Yeah. It's a chilling thought. Okay, so we've got the war in Ukraine escalating. What else is sending shockwaves through the global system?
Well, let's look at the U.S. dollar. It's actually at a one-year high right now.
Really?
Yeah. Which you'd think would be kind of counterintuitive with everything else that's going on in the world.
I would think so. So what's the story there?
Well, it seems to be directly tied to Trump's election win because investors are betting that his policies are going to lead to inflation, and that's going to force the Fed to raise interest rates. And when that happens, it makes the U.S. dollar more attractive to hold on to.
Okay, so explain that to me like I'm not an economics professor.
Okay.
Why does inflation make people want to hold on to U.S. dollars? Isn't that like the opposite of what you'd want to do if your money is losing value?
Okay, so think about it like this. When a new gadget comes out and everyone wants it, the price goes up, right?
Right.
So it's the same with currencies. When investors see inflation coming, they see the U.S. dollar as this safe haven, something that will hold its value better than other currencies. And that just drives up demand.
Yeah.
And that drives up the price.
So it's like they're flocking to the dollar because they're worried about everything else losing value.
Right.
It's like a safe bet in a storm, even if that storm might be caused by the policies of the guy who was just elected.
Exactly. But the thing is, it's kind of a double-edged sword because a strong dollar is great for Americans who are traveling abroad
Right.
and for people importing goods.
Yeah.
But it's not so great for companies who are trying to sell their products overseas.
Oh, I see.
Because suddenly their prices are a lot higher for international buyers.
So what you're saying is my trip to Europe might be cheaper, but all the souvenirs I buy when I'm there are going to be more expensive.
Exactly.
Because they have to adjust for the dollar being so strong.
And this is where things can get a little crazy.
Uh-oh.
Because we could see other countries trying to manipulate their own currencies just to stay competitive. And then some economists even worry that this could lead to something they call a currency war.
Okay, so we've got potential escalation in Ukraine.
Yeah.
We've got a U.S. dollar that's acting like some kind of financial black hole, sucking up value from around the world. What else is in this unsettling mix?
Well, let's look at Europe. Remember that 25% surge in the U.S. stock market that we talked about? Well, at the same time, European markets have been trending down this year. So it's a pretty big difference.
Why is that? Why is it so different? Shouldn't a strong U.S. economy be good for everyone?
Not necessarily. It seems like a big part of the problem is fear. Specifically, fear of Trump's proposed 10% tariff on all foreign imports.
Oh, right.
And European businesses are worried that they're going to lose access to that huge American market.
This is like a high-stakes game of chicken
Exactly.
to see who's going to back down first.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, it's regular people who might end up paying higher prices for everything if no one backs down.
Yeah.
But is that the only reason that European markets are struggling? I mean, Haven't they been dealing with a lot of stuff lately anyway?
Yeah, they have. They've got their own set of challenges, you know.
Yeah.
Everything from like energy shortages to political instability.
Oh, right.
But this trade war with the US definitely isn't helping. It just adds another layer of uncertainty and risk to a situation that's already pretty fragile.
Okay, so we've got tension in Europe, we've got a really volatile dollar, and we've got potential escalation in Ukraine. This is all starting to feel a little bit apocalyptic, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to talk about something a little bit more, optimistic.
Well, I don't know about optimistic, but there is one development that is definitely kind of surprising.
Okay.
Remember a few years back when offshore drilling was like a public enemy number one after that whole Deepwater Horizon disaster?
Uh-huh.
Well, guess what's back in a big way?
No way. Really?
Mhm.
Big oil is doubling down on offshore drilling. No.
Yeah.
Okay. Everything that we know about climate change and like the urgent need to switch to renewable energy, it just seems like a step backwards.
Yeah, it does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it's happening. It's a massive resurgence. Like $104 billion is expected to be invested in offshore drilling just this year alone.
Seriously.
Yeah. And that's the highest level of investment that we've seen since 2016.
Wait, hold up. I thought after Deepwater Horizon there was this huge push to move away from offshore drilling. What happened?
Well, there are a couple things at play.
Okay.
First, there have been some big technological advancements in offshore drilling itself. Companies like Shell, they're using these new platforms. Like there's one called the Vito platform in the Gulf of Mexico. And they say these platforms are a lot cleaner and more efficient than the older models.
Okay, so they're trying to rebrand it as like a responsible and eco-conscious move. But are these new platforms really addressing the core environmental concerns? I mean, at the end of the day, they're still extracting fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's really the crux of the debate. Environmental groups are understandably very concerned.
Yeah.
You know, they point out that oil spills like the devastating Deepwater Horizon incident are still a very real risk. And they also argue that this whole renewed focus on offshore drilling directly contradicts our efforts globally to transition away from fossil fuels,
Yeah.
and to combat climate change.
I see both sides. I mean, on the one hand, we need energy to power our lives right now, but we also know that continuing to rely on fossil fuels is going to have these devastating long-term consequences for the planet.
Yeah.
It feels like we're stuck in this impossible bind.
It is a classic dilemma, and there are no easy answers. But the more we understand the complexities of the issue, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions, both as individuals and as a society. And that's where you, the listener, come in. Like, what stands out to you? What connections are you making?
Yeah. It's so easy to get overwhelmed by all this information. But it's important to remember that we're not just passive observers, right?
Right.
We all have a role to play in shaping what happens next.
Exactly. And we'll talk more about that in the next part of this deep dive.
Yeah.
We'll explore some of the potential solutions and discuss what you can actually do to make a difference.
Right.
So stay tuned. It's pretty amazing how, like, seemingly unrelated events can just kind of cascade across the globe, isn't
Yeah,
it?
totally. It's like one of those domino setups where you just flick one tiny little domino and the whole thing comes crashing down. Except in this case, we're talking about entire economies and political systems.
Exactly. And in today's world where everything is so interconnected, it seems like those chain reactions are happening even faster and with greater intensity than ever before.
Yeah, it's kind of scary. Before the break, we were talking about big oil's comeback with offshore drilling. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about all the emphasis that's been placed on climate change and the push for renewables.
Yeah, it definitely goes against the grain of what a lot of people thought was the future of energy. But I think we have to acknowledge the incredible demand that there is globally for oil and gas. Like, we're talking about really powerful economic forces at play here.
Right. It's not like we can just snap our fingers and switch to 100% renewable energy overnight, right?
Right.
It's going to be a process,
Yeah,
and it's going to take time.
for sure. And in the meantime, countries and companies are making decisions based on a whole bunch of different factors, right?
Okay.
They've got to think about energy needs and economic realities and political pressures. It's hardly ever as simple as it might look on the surface.
Yeah, that's true. So let's break down this offshore drilling boom a little bit more. You mentioned that there's $104 billion being invested this year. That's just an insane amount of money. Where is all of it going?
Well, it's going into new exploration projects and drilling projects, but also it's going into developing new technology. Like, remember that Shell platform we talked about, the Vito platform in the Gulf?
Yeah.
That's just one example of the kinds of innovations that we're seeing in the offshore industry right now.
Okay, so paint me a picture here. How are these new platforms different from those like old clunky oil rigs that we're used to seeing?
Yeah.
The ones that always look like they're one malfunction away from causing an environmental disaster.
Well, for one thing, they're designed to be much more efficient.
Okay.
They use less energy to operate, so that cuts down on the cost, and it also reduces their emissions footprint.
Mm.
They've also got these advanced safety features that are supposed to, minimize the risk of accidents and spills.
So big oil is basically saying like, hey, we learned from our mistakes and we're doing things differently now.
That's definitely the message that they're trying to send. And to be fair, there have been some really big improvements in offshore drilling technology, like especially over the last 10 years or so. But the big question is, are these changes enough to really address the environmental concerns?
Right, because no matter how efficient and safe these new platforms are, they're still extracting and then ultimately burning fossil fuels.
Right.
And we know that that's what's driving climate change.
Exactly. And that's why this whole resurgence of offshore drilling is so controversial, right?
Yeah.
It forces us to confront this really uncomfortable truth, which is that our continued reliance on fossil fuels is at odds with all of our climate goals.
It's like this tug of war, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah.
On the one hand, we've got this urgent need for energy to power our lives. And on the other, we've got these increasingly dire consequences of climate change staring us in the face.
It's a classic dilemma with no easy answers. But I think the more we understand how complex this issue is, the better equipped we'll be to make the right decisions, both as individuals and as a society.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the listener. Like, how might all of these global shifts affect their day-to-day life?
Well, that strong US dollar we were talking about,
Yeah.
that could actually affect the prices that you pay for just everyday goods and services.
Mhm.
And if you're planning a trip overseas, a strong dollar could actually be a good thing. But if you're a business owner who's trying to sell your products to other countries, it could really create some new challenges for you, especially as your products become more expensive for buyers in other countries.
Right.
And that conflict in Ukraine, while it might feel really far away, it does have the potential to destabilize entire regions and mess up global supply chains.
Yeah.
It really just shows how interconnected we all are. Like, events on one continent can have a ripple effect that can be felt around the world.
That's true.
And energy, well, that affects every aspect of our lives. The choices that we make today about how we power our world are going to have really long-lasting impacts, like for generations to come.
Yeah, a lot of responsibility. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the battlefield in Ukraine to the boardrooms of big oil. And we've seen how things that seem totally separate are actually connected in ways that are both really fascinating and, to be honest, kind of scary.
Yeah, I know. It can feel really overwhelming.
Yeah.
But one thing that I always try to remember is that we're not just watching this all happen. We're not just bystanders.
Right.
We can make choices, both big ones and small ones, that can affect how things turn out.
I like that. It's like we can take back some control. We've been exploring some pretty intense global shifts today. Wars, economic turmoil, the return of big oil. It can feel like we're on this runaway train with no brakes.
It's a lot to absorb, but instead of getting stuck in the headlights, maybe we should think about what we can do.
Okay.
It's easy to feel powerless when you're facing these huge global challenges. But I think there are things we can do, both individually and collectively to make a better future.
I could use a dose of optimism right now.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin?
Well, I think we can start with this whole energy dilemma. We talked about big oil making this big gamble on offshore drilling, which, let's be honest, feels like a step backward when it comes to climate change.
Right.
So what's the alternative? What does a sustainable energy future really look like?
Yeah, if we're not supposed to rely on fossil fuels, then what are we supposed to do? Put solar panels on every roof? Windmills everywhere you look?
Well, I don't think it's about finding one magic solution. I think it's about using a bunch of different renewable energy sources. Like solar and wind are great, but you've also got geothermal. Even things like tidal power are starting to become a lot more viable.
Yeah.
Think of it like your investment portfolio.
Uh-huh.
But instead of stocks and bonds, we're talking about different ways to power our lives.
So we're spreading the risk.
Exactly. And this is where you, the listener, can actually do something, Just start by looking at your own energy consumption. Are there ways that you can reduce your reliance on fossil fuels? Maybe invest in some solar panels for your house, or trade in your gas guzzler for an electric car, or just Be more mindful about how much energy you're using in general.
Those are all great ideas. But sometimes that stuff feels a little out of reach for the average person. Not everyone can just go out and buy a Tesla. What about people who are on a tighter budget?
I totally get that. And there are definitely smaller and more affordable steps you can take too.
Hmm.
Like just switching to energy efficient light bulbs, unplugging your electronics when you're not using them, even washing your clothes in cold water. All those little things can really add up.
Yeah, it's about being aware of all those little everyday choices and how they can affect things.
No.
But those individual actions can only go so far, right?
Right.
I mean, we need some big changes. We need systemic change if we're really going to tackle this whole energy crisis.
Absolutely. But remember, you're not alone in wanting a clean energy future. There's this whole global movement happening, and it's really picking up steam. People are pushing for a transition away from fossil fuels. So support those policies that are trying to promote renewable energy. Get involved with some local initiatives, and make your voice heard by contacting the people who represent you.
Right. Voting with your wallet and voting with your actual vote. That can be really powerful when it comes to making change happen.
For sure.
Okay, so we've talked about energy, but what about all this economic craziness we've been seeing
Yeah.
with the strong dollar and potential trade wars brewing? It's a bit unnerving, to say the least.
I agree. But there are some things we can do. First of all, stay informed.
Yeah.
Understand how economic policies are impacting your life, your community,
Yeah.
and the world. Don't just accept everything at face value. Like, really dig in there and ask questions. Challenge assumptions.
It's so easy to just get bogged down with day-to-day life and ignore all the big picture stuff.
Yeah.
But, ignorance isn't bliss when it comes to things like economics.
Definitely not. Knowledge is power. Once you really understand what the issues are, then you can start advocating for policies that promote fairness and sustainability and economic opportunity for everybody. And you can support businesses that are doing things the right way, the way that aligns with your own values.
Right.
Invest ethically and just use your voice to push for a system that's more just and equitable.
Because at the end of the day, the economy isn't just some abstract thing, right? It's about
Yeah.
people's lives. It's about their livelihoods and their hopes and dreams for the future.
Exactly. And speaking of the future, let's go back to Ukraine for a second. This conflict is having such a huge impact on the entire world.
Hmm.
And it can feel helpless to just watch it all happen, but there are things we can do. We can make a difference.
Like what? It just seems so far away. It feels like anything I do is just a drop in the bucket.
Even the small things can make a difference. Just start by supporting some of the humanitarian organizations that are on the ground right now, providing aid to the people who are affected by the conflict. Stay informed. Keep having those discussions about it. And use whatever platform you have, whether it's social media, your local community, or just talking to your friends and family. Use it to advocate for peace and diplomacy.
So just talking about it, raising awareness, that can actually make a difference.
It can. And don't underestimate how much power you have just by contacting your elected officials. Let them know what your concerns are. Remember, you're part of a global community. Your voice matters.
We've covered some pretty heavy topics today, but I'm walking away from this conversation feeling a little bit more empowered, a little bit more hopeful.
Yeah, me too. That's great to hear. The world is definitely in flux. There's no doubt about that. But that also means that there's an opportunity for positive change. And it's really up to all of us to seize that opportunity. So stay informed, stay engaged, and use your voice and your actions to create a better future. That's all for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and insightful and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.